After 37 years of scrubbing their floors, they fired me through a text message. She stared at the phone screen until the words blurred together, her weathered hands trembling as the reality sank in like ice water in her veins. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Please enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world around you. Margaret Santos had always been invisible. At 63, she moved through the marble hallways of the Whitmore estate like a ghost, silent, efficient, and utterly unseen by the family she had served faithfully since she was 26 years old. Her uniform was always pressed, her greying hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades, her soft-soled shoes making no sound as she polished, dusted, and cleaned around people who never bothered to learn her last name. The morning had started like any other. Margaret arrived at the sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills at 5:30 a.m., using her key to enter through the service door as she had done for over 3 decades. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's dinner party, expensive wine and imported cheese, the kind of abundance she could never afford on her modest salary. She had worked that party too, of course, serving champagne to guests who looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, the matriarch of the family, had been entertaining potential donors for her husband's upcoming Senate campaign. Margaret had watched from the edges of the room as Victoria glided between clusters of wealthy socialites, her diamond jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandelier that Margaret cleaned every Wednesday. The irony wasn't lost on her. She knew the value of every piece in that house because she was the one who carefully dusted around them. Yet she earned less in a year than what Victoria spent on a single dress. That morning, Margaret began her routine in the library, carefully wiping down the leather-bound books that no one in the family ever read. She had just finished polishing the mahogany desk when her phone buzzed. At first, she ignored it. Personal calls during work hours had always been discouraged, though the family themselves seemed exempt from such rules, constantly chatting on their phones while she worked around them. But the phone buzzed again and again. When she finally checked, her heart stopped. The text was from Victoria Whitmore herself. "Margaret, due to budget cuts, your services are no longer needed. Please leave your key on the kitchen counter. Do not disturb the family. Your final check will be mailed." No signature, no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the nearly 4 decades Margaret had spent maintaining their perfect life. Margaret read the message 3 times, each reading making the words feel more surreal. Budget cuts. The same week they had purchased a 3rd vacation home in the Hamptons. The same month Victoria had thrown a $50,000 birthday party for her spoiled daughter Sophia. She sank into the leather chair she had never been allowed to sit in, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The room spun as memories flooded back. 37 years of Christmas mornings cleaning up wrapping paper while her own grandchildren opened modest gifts miles away. 37 years of working through holidays while the family traveled to exotic destinations. 37 years of listening to their problems, their complaints about staff, their casual discussions of money, amounts that represented more than she made in months. The cruelest part was the silence that followed. No phone call, no explanation, no goodbye from the little boy she had helped raise, who was now a successful lawyer with children of his own. No acknowledgement from Sophia, now 28, whose scraped knees Margaret had bandaged, and whose teenage tears she had quietly witnessed during late-night kitchen conversations. She was simply discarded. Margaret forced herself to stand, her arthritic knees protesting after decades of scrubbing floors and climbing stairs. She walked through the house one final time, her eyes taking in every detail she had maintained so carefully. The Persian rug she had vacuumed weekly, the crystal vases she had polished until they sparkled, the family photographs she had dusted, photos that documented a life of privilege she had helped maintain but never shared. In the kitchen, she placed her key on the marble counter with trembling fingers. The sound it made seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, a tiny metallic clink that somehow represented the end of more than half her adult life. As she walked toward the service door for the last time, she heard footsteps upstairs. Victoria's voice drifted down, talking animatedly on the phone about lunch plans at the country club. Life was already moving on without her, as if Margaret Santos had never existed at all. The morning sun felt different on her face as she stepped outside, harsher, less forgiving. At 63, with no other skills than the invisible work that had consumed her life, Margaret realized with growing horror that she wasn't just losing a job, she was losing her identity, her security, and quite possibly her future. Standing in the driveway of the mansion she had called home for 37 years, Margaret Santos faced a terrifying truth. When you're invisible your whole life, no one notices when you disappear completely. Margaret sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at the walls covered with photos of other people's children, not her own grandchildren, though she had those too scattered in small frames on her nightstand, but pictures of the Whitmore children through the years. Sophia's first steps, taken while Margaret was mopping the kitchen floor. Young Michael's graduation from Harvard, where Margaret had ironed his gown at 5 in the morning. Birthday parties, holiday celebrations, milestone moments, all captured while Margaret worked silently in the background, invisible but essential. She had been 26 when she first knocked on the Whitmore's door, a young widow desperate for work after her husband Carlos died in a construction accident. Baby Sophia was only 2 then, crying inconsolably while Victoria paced the marble foyer in frustration. "I've been through 6 nannies this month," Victoria had snapped during the interview. "If you can't handle a simple child, don't waste my time." But Margaret could handle more than a simple child. She could handle everything. For 37 years, she had been the invisible thread holding the Whitmore household together. When Sophia was 7 and came down with pneumonia, it was Margaret who sat by her bedside through the night, while Victoria attended a charity gala. "The poor darling is asking for you," Victoria had told Margaret the next morning, as if it were perfectly natural that a sick child would prefer the maid over her own mother. When Michael was 12 and struggling with bullies at his private school, he had confided in Margaret during after-school snacks in the kitchen. She had listened, offered gentle advice, and even secretly taught him basic self-defense moves in the garden shed. "You're like a guardian angel," he had whispered to her once, and Margaret's heart had swelled with a pride she wasn't supposed to feel. She remembered the nights she had stayed late without extra pay, helping Victoria prepare for important dinner parties. While Victoria fretted about seating arrangements and wine selections, Margaret had quietly solved every crisis, finding last-minute replacements for broken stemware, covering for catering mishaps, even lending Victoria her own grandmother's pearl earrings when Victoria's jewelry was being cleaned. Those earrings had been the only valuable thing Margaret owned, inherited from her mother, who had also spent her life in service to wealthy families. "You're so reliable, Margaret," Victoria would say with that practiced smile. "I don't know what we'd do without you." But when Margaret's own mother was dying in the county hospital, requesting just 1 day off to say goodbye, Victoria had sighed dramatically. "Really, Margaret, during the spring fundraiser, can't this wait until next week?" Margaret had attended her mother's funeral during her lunch break. The sacrifices had been endless and unacknowledged. Margaret's own children, 2 daughters she had raised as a single mother, grew up seeing her only in the early mornings and late evenings. They learned to make their own dinners, help each other with homework, and tuck themselves into bed, while Margaret was across town reading bedtime stories to children who weren't her own. "Why can't you just get a normal job?" her younger daughter Elena had asked once, tears streaming down her 8-year-old face. "Other mums pick their kids up from school. Other mums come to the school plays." Margaret had missed Elena's first school play because Victoria needed her to supervise the installation of new curtains. She had missed her older daughter Rosa's high school graduation because the Whitmores were hosting a political fundraiser that couldn't possibly proceed without Margaret ensuring every detail was perfect. "You girls understand," Margaret had said, counting out her modest paycheck and trying to stretch it to cover school supplies and rent. "Mama works hard so you can have better lives someday." But the better lives seemed always just out of reach. Margaret's salary had barely increased over the decades, and the promised raises never materialized. "Times are tough," Mr. Whitmore would say, while purchasing his 3rd luxury car. "We all have to tighten our belts." Yet Margaret noticed that the family's belt-tightening never seemed to affect their designer clothes, expensive vacations, or frequent redecorating projects. She had watched the Whitmore children grow up with every advantage: private schools, tutors, music lessons, summer camps in Europe. Meanwhile, her own daughters attended public school with worn textbooks and outdated computers. Rosa had dreamed of becoming a doctor, but college was impossible without loans Margaret couldn't afford to co-sign. Elena had wanted to study art, but settled for community college and a practical degree in accounting. "Maybe next year," Margaret had said so many times it became a family joke. "When things get better, maybe next year." The most painful memories were the holidays. Christmas at the Whitmore house was an elaborate production. A 12-foot tree decorated by professional designers, gifts wrapped in expensive paper, catered meals for extended family and important friends. Margaret would arrive at dawn to prepare everything, staying until late evening to clean up the aftermath of their perfect family celebration. Then she would drive home to her own small apartment, where her daughters had long since stopped waiting up for. Their modest tree, usually purchased from the discount lot on Christmas Eve, would be surrounded by a few small gifts Margaret had managed to afford. The girls learned not to ask for expensive things, understanding without being told that their mother's labor enriched other people's children, not them. "I'm proud of you, Mama," Rosa had said on Margaret's 60th birthday, hugging her tired mother. "You worked so hard for us." But Margaret could hear the sadness underneath the pride, the recognition of how much they had all sacrificed for a family that barely acknowledged Margaret's existence. The worst part was how invisible her dedication had become. After the first decade, the Whitmores stopped noticing the 1,000 small things Margaret did to make their lives effortless. They didn't see her arriving early to have their coffee ready exactly how they liked it. They didn't notice her staying late to iron their clothes for important meetings. They certainly didn't acknowledge the times she used her own money to replace items that broke or ran out, rather than bothering them with such trivial concerns. "You're so lucky to work for such a nice family," people would tell her at church or in the grocery store. Margaret would smile and nod, never revealing the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw her only as a function, never as a person with her own dreams, struggles, and heartaches. She had convinced herself that loyalty would eventually be rewarded, that her years of faithful service meant something. Even as she watched other household staff come and go, some fired for minor infractions, others leaving for better opportunities, Margaret stayed. She told herself she was appreciated, needed, valued. Now sitting in her small living room with a termination text message and 37 years of invisible labor reduced to nothing, Margaret finally understood the truth. She had spent her entire adult life loving a family that had never loved her back. 3 days after receiving the text message that ended her career, Margaret found herself standing in the unemployment office in downtown Los Angeles, clutching a manila folder containing 37 years of spotless employment history. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of people who, like her, had suddenly found themselves adrift in a world that had no use for them. "Next," called the clerk, a tired-looking woman barely older than Margaret's own daughters. Margaret approached the counter, her worn purse clutched tightly in her hands. She had dressed carefully for this appointment. Her best dress, the navy blue one she wore to church, and the sensible shoes that had carried her through countless days of service. "I need to file for unemployment benefits," Margaret said quietly, sliding her folder across the counter. The clerk glanced at Margaret's paperwork with practiced indifference. Employment history. 37 years with the same family. The Whitmores. Something shifted in the clerk's expression. "The Whitmores, as in Congressman Whitmore?" "Yes, I was their housekeeper." The woman's eyebrows raised and she leaned back in her chair. 37 years. "And they just let you go?" Margaret nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Around them, other people waiting in line began to listen, sensing drama. "What did you do wrong?" the clerk asked loudly, her voice carrying across the room. "I mean, nobody gets fired after 37 years unless they did something serious." I didn't do anything wrong," Margaret stammered, aware that conversations around them had stopped. "They said it was budget cuts." The clerk snorted. "Budget cuts? Lady, the Whitmores just bought a mansion in Malibu. I saw it in the society pages. $28 million. She turned to her computer, typing aggressively. "You sure you didn't steal something? Get caught drinking on the job? Because honest people don't get thrown away like trash after 4 decades. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Thrown away like trash. The phrase echoed in her mind as she felt dozens of eyes watching her, judging her, assuming she must have done something terrible to deserve such treatment. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to fill out these additional forms," the clerk continued, her voice dripping with skepticism. "And we'll need references. Good luck getting those from the family that fired you." Margaret took the papers with shaking hands and found a seat in the corner, trying to ignore the whispers around her. An older man, leaning on a cane, looked at her with pity. 37 years, he murmured to his companion. Must have been something bad. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the bank to discuss her financial situation. Her savings account, carefully built over decades of minimal spending, held just over $3,000. Her Social Security wouldn't kick in for 2 more years, and unemployment benefits would barely cover her rent, let alone food and medical expenses. "I'm afraid there's another issue, Mrs. Santos," the bank manager said, reviewing her account. "Your credit score has dropped significantly in the past week." Margaret frowned. "I don't understand. I've never missed a payment on anything." The manager's fingers clicked across his keyboard. "It appears you were listed as a reference for several credit applications, large purchases. The applications were denied due to insufficient income verification, but your name is associated with the inquiries." A cold dread settled in Margaret's stomach. What kind of purchases? A BMW lease, a luxury apartment rental in Santa Monica, a country club membership. He looked up at her with concern. "Mrs. Santos, did you authorize anyone to use your name as a reference?" Margaret's mind raced back to the countless times Victoria had asked her to sign papers. "Just insurance forms," Victoria would say casually. "Nothing important, just updating our household staff information." Or, "The accountant needs your signature for tax purposes." Margaret had always signed without question, trusting the family she had served so faithfully. "I think," Margaret's voice barely whispered, "I think I was tricked." The revelation hit her like a tsunami. For years, the Whitmores had been using her name and personal information to pad their credit applications. Her spotless employment history, her stability, her good standing in the community, they had exploited it all to secure better rates on their luxury purchases. When Margaret called the credit reporting agency from the bank's lobby, the truth became even more devastating. Her name appeared as a reference on applications dating back 15 years. Dozens of them. Every time the Whitmores wanted to purchase something expensive, they had listed Margaret Santos, their loyal, trusted housekeeper, as a character reference and employment verification. "The good news," the credit agency representative explained, "is that you're not financially liable for any of these purchases. The bad news is that your credit profile has been tagged for suspicious activity. It'll take months to clear this up, and during that time you'll have difficulty qualifying for any loans or even rental applications." Margaret hung up the phone and sat in her car in the bank parking lot, staring at the steering wheel through tears of rage and humiliation. They hadn't just fired her. They had used her. For years, while she was polishing their silver and raising their children, they had been treating her identity like another household tool, something to be used when convenient and discarded when no longer needed. That evening, Margaret's daughter Rosa called with news that made everything worse. "Mama, I saw something strange on Facebook," Rosa said, her voice tight with anger. "Sophia Whitmore posted something about their spring cleaning. So she's showing off all the stuff they're getting rid of." Margaret's heart sank. What kind of stuff? Designer clothes, expensive furniture, jewelry, and Mama, Rosa's voice broke. "She's calling it clearing out the help's leftovers. She's making jokes about how some people collect things that don't belong to them." The accusation was clear. Sophia was implying that Margaret had been stealing from them. To her thousands of social media followers, she was painting a picture of a dishonest housekeeper who had been caught and dismissed. Margaret drove to the library to see the post for herself. There, on Sophia's Instagram account, viewed by 15,000 followers, were photos of items Margaret recognized. The small silver picture frame that had gone missing months ago, Margaret had been blamed for losing it. The antique brooch that Victoria claimed had disappeared. Margaret had spent hours searching for it, apologizing profusely. Several other items that had mysteriously vanished over the years, always resulting in suspicious looks and pointed questions about Margaret's honesty. The caption read, "Spring cleaning after finally getting rid of some sticky-fingered staff. Amazing what people think they can get away with when you trust them. Good riddance. Blessed, clean house, trust issues." The comments were worse. Hundreds of people Margaret didn't know were calling her a thief, a criminal, trash. Some were even sharing the post, spreading the lie further. She probably stole way more than that. These people have no shame, take advantage of a nice family for decades. Should press charges, make an example. Margaret sat in the library chair, trembling as she read comment after comment, destroying her reputation among complete strangers. 37 years of honest service reduced to a social media joke. Her name would forever be associated with theft and betrayal, all because she had been too trusting, too loyal, too invisible to protect herself. She closed the laptop and walked outside into the evening air. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret Santos felt something she had never allowed herself to feel toward the Whitmore family. Pure, burning rage. In her purse, she still carried the small notebook where she had kept track of every extra hour worked, every personal expense she had covered for the family, every promise they had broken. She had never intended to use it for anything. It was just her way of staying organized. But as she sat in her car, staring at the notebook's worn pages, Margaret realized it wasn't just a record of her service. It was evidence. And for the first time in 37 years, Margaret Santos was ready to be seen. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m., jolting Margaret from the first decent sleep she'd had in a week. The caller ID showed a number she knew by heart, the Whitmore residence. For a moment, her conditioned response almost made her answer with her usual, "Good morning, how may I help you?" But she caught herself and simply said, "Hello, Margaret." Victoria's voice was honey-sweet, the tone she used when she needed something important. "Darling, I'm so glad I caught you. Listen, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Margaret said nothing, gripping the phone tighter. "You see, Richard's campaign manager is being absolutely ridiculous about our household expenses. They're demanding documentation for everything. Every employee, every payment going back years, can you imagine? As if we're criminals or something." Victoria's laugh was forced, brittle. Margaret could picture her perfectly, pacing in her silk robe, diamond wedding ring catching the morning light as she gestured dramatically. "The thing is, sweetheart, we need you to sign some papers, just confirming that your termination was mutual, you understand, for the campaign. We can't have any negative publicity right now, what with Richard announcing his Senate run next month." The word sweetheart made Margaret's skin crawl. Victoria hadn't called her anything but Margaret or the help in 37 years. "And Margaret," Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I know that little social media incident with Sophia was unfortunate. You know how young people are these days with their phones. But if you could just sign these papers, I'm prepared to offer you a very generous severance package. Say $5,000, cash, today. $5,000, for a family that spent more than that on a single dinner party, for people who had just purchased a $28 million mansion." The insulting amount hung in the air like a slap. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, "I need time to think." "Oh, but darling, time is rather of the essence. The campaign team needs this resolved by noon, or they're talking about conducting some sort of investigation. You wouldn't want that, would you? All those uncomfortable questions, lawyers poking around in everyone's business." The threat was clear beneath the sugar-coated words. Sign the papers, take the money, disappear quietly, or face the full force of the Whitmore legal machine. "I'll call you back," Margaret said, and hung up. Within an hour, her phone was buzzing constantly. First Michael called, his voice strained with false concern. "Margaret, I hope you know this whole thing has gotten completely out of hand. Mum's beside herself with worry about you. She told me about the generous offer. $5,000 is more than most people get after being let go. I mean, considering the current economic climate." Next came Sophia, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Margaret, I'm so sorry about that Instagram post. I was just having a bad day, you know. Sometimes I say things without thinking. But everyone knows it was just social media drama. Nobody takes that stuff seriously." The calls kept coming. Richard Whitmore himself called from his campaign bus, speaking to her like she was a potential voter he needed to win over. Even Victoria's mother, the elderly Mrs. Pemberton, called with shaking voice to tell Margaret how proud she was of her and how she hoped they could put this unpleasantness behind them. Each call felt like another weight pressing down on her chest. These people who had barely acknowledged her existence for decades were suddenly desperate for her cooperation. The difference was stark and telling. When they needed something from her, Margaret suddenly mattered. But it was the visit from their lawyer that broke something inside her. Harrison Mills arrived at Margaret's apartment complex at 2 p.m., stepping out of a black Mercedes, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. He didn't bother coming up to her apartment. Instead, he sent the building's maintenance man, Luis, to fetch her. "Lady in 4B, Luis said apologetically, his English heavily accented. "Fancy man downstairs wants to see you. He says it's about your job." Margaret found Mills leaning against his car in the parking lot, briefcase in hand, looking around the modest complex with barely concealed disdain. When he saw her, his smile was coldly professional. "Mrs. Santos, Harrison Mills, attorney for the Whitmore family. I think we can resolve this little situation very quickly." He opened his briefcase without invitation, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "This is a mutual separation agreement, very standard. It confirms that your employment ended by mutual consent, with no fault on either side. In exchange, you receive a severance payment and agree not to discuss your employment with the media or any third parties. Margaret glanced at the papers, recognizing words like confidentiality and non-disclosure scattered throughout the dense legal text. I don't understand most of this, she said honestly. Mills smiled patronizingly. You don't need to understand it, Mrs. Santos. You just need to sign it. I have a notary waiting in my car and I can have your check cut immediately. When Margaret hesitated, his tone sharpened. Mrs. Santos, I should mention that the family has discovered some irregularities in their household inventory over the years, missing items. They've chosen not to pursue those matters, but of course, that goodwill depends on your cooperation today. The threat was unmistakable. Sign the papers or face criminal charges. Margaret stared at this man who spoke to her like she was something distasteful. He needed to scrape off his shoe. Behind him, she could see Luis watching from the building entrance, his face dark with anger at witnessing such disrespect in his community. I need to think about it, Margaret said quietly. Mills's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing irritation. Mrs. Santos, this offer expires at 5 o'clock today. I strongly advise you not to let emotions cloud your judgment. The Whitmores are very powerful people with very powerful friends. It would be unwise to make them your enemies. After he left, Margaret sat on the concrete steps of her building, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The message was clear. Sign the papers and disappear or be destroyed. That's when Luis sat down beside her. You okay, Mrs. Santos? He asked gently. Luis was probably 50, with calloused hands and kind eyes. She'd seen him around the building for 2 years, but had never really talked to him, just polite nods in the hallway. I don't know, Margaret admitted. Luis was quiet for a moment, then said, My wife, she used to work for rich family too. 20 years. One day the man of the house, he tried to touch her inappropriately. When she say no, they fire her. Say she steal money. His jaw tightened. They ruin her reputation. Make it so no one else will hire her. Margaret looked at him with new understanding. But you know what? Luis continued, pulling out his phone. My daughter, she's lawyer now. She work for organization that help people like you, people who get treated bad by rich families. He showed Margaret a business card on his phone screen. Elena Morales Legal Aid Society. She helped my wife fight back. She can help you too. For the first time in days, Margaret felt a tiny flicker of hope. People like them, Luis said, gesturing in the direction the lawyer had gone. They think they can treat us like dirt because we clean their houses, fix their cars, take care of their children. But we are people too. We have rights too. He stood up, dusting off his work pants. You seem like a good person, Mrs. Santos. Don't let them make you disappear. You matter. As evening fell, Margaret sat in her small kitchen with Luis's daughter's business card in one hand and the Whitmores' legal papers in the other. The contrast was stark. One represented continued invisibility and silence. The other, an uncertain but dignified fight for justice. Her phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. Margaret, please don't make this difficult. Sign the papers. Take the money. Move on with your life. You've always been so sensible. Margaret stared at the word sensible, the label that had defined her for 37 years. The sensible woman who never complained, never demanded, never fought back. For the first time in her life, Margaret Santos was ready to be unreasonable. At 4:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the lawyer's deadline, Margaret stood outside the Whitmore estate for what she thought would be the last time. But instead of walking to the service entrance, as she had done for 37 years, she walked straight to the front door, the entrance reserved for family and important guests, and rang the bell. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see movement inside, hushed voices, the sound of expensive heels clicking across marble floors. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Victoria who greeted her, but their current housekeeper, a nervous young woman named Carmen, who couldn't have been older than 25. Mrs. Santos, Carmen whispered, glancing over her shoulder anxiously. You're not supposed to be here. Mrs. Whitmore said, Tell Mrs. Whitmore that Margaret Santos is here to discuss her contract, Margaret said firmly, stepping into the foyer uninvited for the first time in her life. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandelier, floors she had polished weekly for decades. The Persian rug beneath her feet was one she had carefully cleaned countless times, removing wine stains from dinner parties she had served but never attended. Standing in this space as something other than help felt surreal, like stepping into a photograph of someone else's life. Victoria appeared at the top of the curved staircase, descending with calculated grace. She was wearing a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than Margaret's annual grocery budget. But beneath her composed exterior, Margaret could see tension in the way Victoria gripped the banister. "Margaret, darling, what a surprise," Victoria said, her voice strained. "Though I must say using the front entrance is rather unusual." 37 years, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying through the high-ceilinged space. 37 years I used the back door. Today I thought I'd see what it feels like to be treated like a person, instead of a piece of furniture. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "Now, Margaret, there's no need for dramatics. Did you bring the signed papers? Harrison said you were going to think about it." "I did think about it," Margaret replied, reaching into her purse. But instead of pulling out the legal documents, she withdrew her worn notebook, the one she'd kept meticulously for all these years. "I thought about a lot of things." From the kitchen doorway, Carmen watched with wide eyes. Margaret could see Michael emerging from the library, his phone pressed to his ear. Even from across the room, she could hear him speaking in urgent whispers. "Yes, she's here now. I don't know what she wants." "Margaret," Victoria said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "I hope you're not going to make this unpleasant for everyone. We've been very generous." "Generous?" Margaret's voice rose for the first time in 37 years inside this house. "You call stealing my identity generous? Using my name on credit applications for 15 years? Posting lies about me on social media? Threatening to have me arrested for theft when you know I never took anything that wasn't freely given?" Victoria's face paled. "I don't know what you think you know, but I know everything," Margaret said, opening her notebook. "I know about the Christmas bonus you promised me in 1987 that never came. I know about the health insurance you said you'd provide in 1993 that you never signed up for. I know about the retirement fund you claimed to be contributing to that doesn't exist." Her voice grew stronger with each revelation. Behind Victoria, Margaret could see Sophia appearing on the landing, her phone already out, probably preparing to document this confrontation for her social media audience. "I know about the times you used my credit as a reference when yours wasn't good enough. I know about the jewelry you reported as stolen that's sitting in your safe deposit box, because I heard you talking to your insurance agent about it. I know about the tax deductions you've been claiming for charitable donations you never made, using my church's name and forged receipts." Victoria's mask was slipping now, her composure cracking. "You're being ridiculous, Margaret. You're upset about losing your job and you're imagining things." "Am I imagining this?" Margaret pulled out a small digital recorder, one her daughter Rosa had bought her years ago to record family stories for her grandchildren. "December 15th, 2019. You and Mr. Whitmore discussing how to hide campaign contributions that exceeded legal limits. You were sitting right there," she pointed to the living room, "and I was dusting the mantelpiece. You talked for 20 minutes about shell companies and offshore accounts." The color drained from Victoria's face completely. "Or this one," Margaret continued, pressing another button. "July 3rd, 2021. You telling Sophia exactly how to manipulate the college admissions process, including bribing someone to take her SATs. You were so loud I could hear every word from the kitchen." Margaret had never intended to record these conversations. The device had been running accidentally in her apron pocket, forgotten after she'd been practicing a speech for her church's anniversary celebration. But over the years, it had captured dozens of private family moments, moments that revealed the Whitmores' true character, when they thought no one was listening. "This is ridiculous," Michael said, striding into the foyer. "Those recordings are illegal. You can't—" "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "in California, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation, and Mrs. Santos was present for all of these." Everyone turned to see a young Latina woman in a sharp business suit standing in the open doorway. Elena Morales, Luis's daughter, the lawyer he had told Margaret about. "Elena Morales, Legal Aid Society," she said, stepping into the foyer with the confidence of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to stand. "I'm representing Mrs. Santos in matters related to identity theft, fraudulent use of personal information, wrongful termination, and wage theft spanning several decades." Victoria found her voice first. "This is private property. You have no right—" "The door was open," Elena said smoothly, "and Mrs. Santos was invited here to sign documents. I'm simply here to ensure she understands her rights before signing anything. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 37 years, the sensation of having someone powerful on her side. Now, Elena continued, pulling out her own set of papers, I've reviewed the separation agreement your attorney prepared. It's interesting how it includes non-disclosure clauses about alleged improprieties, when no such improprieties were mentioned in the termination. That suggests awareness of wrongdoing. She handed Victoria a document. This is a formal complaint we'll be filing with the district attorney's office regarding identity theft, tax fraud, and campaign finance violations. We're also filing a civil suit for unpaid wages, benefits, and damages related to reputation harm. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear the grandfather clock in the corner, the one she had wound every week for decades, ticking away the seconds of her former life. However, Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly, Mrs. Santos is willing to consider an alternative resolution. Victoria grabbed onto this lifeline desperately. What kind of alternative? Margaret stepped forward, and for the first time in 37 years, she looked Victoria Whitmore directly in the eyes as an equal. A public apology, Margaret said clearly, posted on every social media account where I was slandered. A full retraction of all accusations of theft. A truthful statement about my 37 years of loyal service. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Additionally, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, a severance payment equal to 1 year's salary for every decade I worked here. That's approximately $400,000, less than what you spent on your bathroom renovation last year. That's outrageous, Sophia shrieked from the stairs. She's just the help. You can't give her that much money. The words hung in the air like a slap. Just the help. After 37 years, that's still all they saw. Margaret closed her notebook and looked around the foyer one last time, at the marble she had polished, the artwork she had dusted, the family portraits she had carefully maintained, all evidence of a life she had helped create, but never been allowed to truly join. You're right, Sophia, Margaret said quietly. I was just the help, but I was also the one who kept your secrets. I was the one who raised you when your parents were too busy. I was the one who held this family together while you all took credit for your perfect lives. She turned toward the door, Elena beside her. You have 48 hours to decide, Margaret said without looking back. After that, we file everything with the authorities and let the voters decide how they feel about electing someone who built his fortune on the backs of people he treated as invisible. As they reached the door, Margaret paused and looked back one final time. Oh, and Victoria, next time you want to ruin someone's life, make sure they haven't been listening to yours for 37 years. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but it sounded like thunder to Margaret Santos, the sound of a woman who had finally found her voice. The next morning, Margaret woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word had spread through Beverly Hills' elite social circles like wildfire. The help was fighting back, and she had ammunition. Elena called at 8 a.m. with an update that made Margaret's coffee taste sweeter than it had in weeks. Margaret, you need to see the news, Elena said, barely containing her excitement. Channel 7 picked up the story. Someone leaked information about Richard Whitmore's campaign finance irregularities to the press. Margaret turned on her small television and watched in amazement as a perfectly coiffed news anchor discussed allegations of impropriety surrounding Congressman Whitmore's Senate campaign. The story didn't mention Margaret by name, but it referenced a long-time household employee who may have evidence of financial misconduct. By noon, 3 more news stations had picked up the story. Political reporters were calling it a potential scandal that could derail Whitmore's Senate aspirations. The timing couldn't have been worse for the family. Richard was scheduled to announce his official candidacy in just 2 days. Margaret's phone rang constantly. First came Harrison Mills, the lawyer, his earlier arrogance replaced by barely controlled panic. Mrs. Santos, my clients are prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement. Perhaps we were too hasty yesterday. The family has great affection for you and wants to resolve this amicably. Next came Michael, his voice tight with desperation. Margaret, please, you have to understand. This isn't just about my parents. I have children now. My law practice, my reputation. Please, can't we work something out? Name your price. But it was the call from Victoria that revealed just how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Margaret, Victoria's voice was small, defeated, nothing like the commanding tone she'd used for 37 years. I need to speak with you. In person, please. They met at a small coffee shop in Margaret's neighborhood, neutral territory, far from the marble palaces of Beverly Hills. Margaret arrived first, choosing a table by the window where she could watch Victoria's Mercedes pull up outside. Through the glass, she saw Victoria sitting in her car for several minutes, clearly steeling herself for a conversation she'd never imagined having to have. When Victoria finally entered, Margaret barely recognized her. Gone was the perfectly styled hair and designer outfit. Instead, Victoria looked older, smaller, wearing simple jeans and a sweater with no jewelry, except her wedding ring. For the first time in their relationship, Victoria looked like she needed something from Margaret more than Margaret had ever needed anything from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Victoria said, sliding into the booth across from Margaret. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the menu. "Just coffee," Margaret told the approaching waitress. "For both of us." They sat in silence until the coffee arrived. Margaret waited, remembering all the times she'd been expected to speak first, to apologize first, to make others comfortable. Not today. Finally, Victoria spoke. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In 37 years, I've never had to ask you for anything." Margaret almost laughed at the irony. Victoria had asked her for everything, every single day, just never as an equal. "The recordings," Victoria continued, staring into her coffee cup. "How long have you been collecting them?" "I wasn't collecting anything," Margaret said honestly. "I was practicing speeches for church. The recorder was in my pocket and I forgot it was there. But after a while, when I heard the kinds of things you all said when you thought no one was listening," she trailed off, letting Victoria fill in the blanks. "Margaret, I need you to understand something," Victoria said, finally meeting her eyes. "What you heard, what we said, it sounds worse than it is. Everyone in politics bends the rules a little. Everyone with money finds ways to optimize their situation." Margaret felt a familiar sensation, the urge to nod, to agree, to make Victoria feel better about herself. But this time she resisted. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said calmly, "you taught your daughter how to cheat on her college entrance exams. You claimed tax deductions for charity donations you never made. You used my name on credit applications without my knowledge. She paused, remembering one particularly painful recording. "You told your friends at a dinner party that you kept me around because I was too stupid to steal anything valuable and too grateful to quit." Victoria's face crumpled. "I never meant." "Margaret, you have to understand. Sometimes people say things in private that they don't really mean. Sometimes we need to feel superior to cope with our own problems." "Your problems?" Margaret's voice remained steady, but something sharp crept into it. "Your biggest problem was choosing between the Malibu house and the Hamptons house. My biggest problem was choosing between buying groceries and paying for my daughter's school supplies." For the first time in 37 years, Victoria Whitmore was speechless. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "Do you remember when my mother was dying and I asked for one day off to say goodbye? You told me it was inconvenient. Do you remember when Rosa graduated high school as valedictorian and I asked to leave 2 hours early to attend her ceremony? You said the dinner party was more important." Each memory hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had the grace to look ashamed, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Do you remember last Christmas when I worked a double shift so you could have your perfect party? When I went home that night, my grandchildren asked why Grandma always missed Christmas. My 5-year-old granddaughter asked if Santa didn't bring presents to poor kids' grandmas." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but Margaret felt no satisfaction in her pain, only the relief of finally speaking 37 years of truth. "What do you want, Margaret?" Victoria whispered. "Tell me what you want and I'll make it happen." Margaret had thought about this moment for days. Eleanor had advised her to demand the maximum, the full settlement, criminal prosecution, complete destruction of the Whitmore family's reputation. "Make them pay for every year they stole from you," Elena had said. But sitting across from this broken woman who had controlled her life for so long, Margaret realized that revenge wasn't what she wanted. She wanted something much more powerful. "I want you to remember my name," Margaret said quietly. "Not just Margaret, the help. Margaret Santos, the woman who raised your children while you were building your social life. Margaret Santos, who knew your family's secrets and kept them safe. Margaret Santos, who worked 18-hour days so you could live your perfect life." Victoria nodded through her tears. "I want you to post a public statement explaining that I never stole anything, that I was terminated due to budget cuts, and that I served your family with honesty and dedication for 37 years. Yes, Victoria whispered. I want a settlement that reflects 37 years of unpaid overtime, missed holidays and stolen opportunities. $400,000. Victoria's face went pale, but she nodded again. And I want you to personally apologize to every single person who read your daughter's social media lies about me. Margaret, Sophia's post was seen by 15,000 people. Then you'll be very busy, Margaret said simply. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook, something Margaret had never seen her use in all their years together. Usually such mundane tasks were handled by assistants. I can write you a check right now, Victoria said, her hand trembling as she uncapped her pen. For the full amount, but I need to ask you something. Margaret waited. The recordings about Richard's campaign, will you destroy them? Margaret considered this. The recordings were her insurance policy, her guarantee that the Whitmores would never try to harm her again, but they were also evidence of crimes that went far beyond her personal grievances. I'll make you a deal, Margaret said. I'll give you copies of everything that directly concerns your family's personal business. The conversations about Sophia's college cheating, your tax issues, the social gossip, but the recordings about campaign finance violations and election fraud, those belong to the voters, not to you. Victoria's face went white. Margaret, please, Richard's entire career should have been built on honesty from the beginning, Margaret finished. I won't actively pursue criminal charges against your family for the personal things you did to me, but I won't help you cover up crimes against the public either. Victoria stared at the check she'd been writing, the pen frozen in her hand. This is my final offer, Margaret said, standing up from the booth. You have until tomorrow at noon. After that, Eleanor files everything with the authorities, and we let the justice system sort it out. As Margaret walked toward the door, she heard Victoria's voice, small and broken. Margaret, I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry. Margaret paused at the door, but didn't turn around. Mrs. Whitmore, in 37 years, that's the first time you've ever apologized to me for anything. It's a good start. Outside the coffee shop, Margaret breathed deeply of the warm Los Angeles air. For the first time in decades, she felt like she could breathe freely. No longer invisible, no longer voiceless, no longer powerless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Channel 4 wants to interview you. Are you ready to tell your story to the world? Margaret looked at the message and smiled. Margaret Santos was ready to be seen. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a brand new dress, the first piece of clothing she'd bought for herself in over 5 years. It was a simple navy blue dress with small white flowers, nothing fancy, but it fit her perfectly and made her feel like the woman she was meant to be rather than the invisible shadow she'd been forced to become. Today was the day of her television interview with Channel 4's investigative team, and for the first time in her adult life, Margaret Santos was nervous about being seen. The settlement check had cleared 2 days ago, $400,000, more money than Margaret had ever imagined having at once. Eleanor had helped her open a proper savings account at a real bank, not the check-cashing place she'd been using for years. The bank manager, a kind woman named Patricia, had treated Margaret with the respect that money apparently commanded, offering investment advice and retirement planning services with a smile that felt genuine rather than patronizing. You've worked hard for this, Patricia had said, reviewing Margaret's account. It's time to let your money work for you for a change. Margaret's daughters had cried when she called them with the news. Rosa, now a successful accountant despite never getting the college support she'd deserved, had whispered through her tears, Mama, you can finally rest. You can finally do something for yourself. Eleanor, now 38, had been more direct. I'm proud of you, Mum. It took courage to fight back after all those years. You showed them that invisible doesn't mean powerless, but the money, as life-changing as it was, hadn't been the most meaningful part of Margaret's victory. It was what happened on social media that truly restored her dignity. Victoria had kept her promise. The apology post appeared on the Whitmore family's Facebook page, Instagram account, and Twitter feed. It was longer and more detailed than Margaret had expected. I want to publicly apologize to Margaret Santos, who served our family with unwavering dedication for 37 years. Recent social media posts suggesting that Mrs. Santos was terminated for misconduct were completely false and unacceptable. Mrs. Santos never stole anything from our family. She was terminated solely due to household budget adjustments. Throughout her decades of service, she demonstrated exceptional honesty, reliability, and care for our family. She helped raise our children, maintained our home, and earned our deepest respect. Any suggestion otherwise was wrong, hurtful, and beneath the standards Mrs. Santos deserves. We are grateful for her years of faithful service and wish her every happiness in her future endeavors. The Whitmore family. The post had generated thousands of comments, most of them supportive of Margaret. But more importantly, it had been shared by major news outlets covering the broader story of Richard Whitmore's campaign finance scandal. The political fallout had been swift and devastating. Within a week of the recordings being released to federal investigators, Richard Whitmore had withdrawn from the Senate race. 2 days later, he'd resigned from his House seat, citing family considerations and the need to address legal matters privately. Margaret had watched his resignation speech on television, feeling an odd mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life, but she'd learned that some people's lives were built on foundations that deserved to crumble. Now, sitting in the Channel 4 studios waiting for her interview, Margaret reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. The hostile social media comments about her had been replaced by messages of support from women across the country who'd recognized their own struggles in her story. "Thank you for showing us that we matter," one woman had written. "I've been cleaning houses for 20 years, and I always felt ashamed. You made me realize that honest work deserves respect." Another message came from a young woman in Texas. "My grandmother worked as a maid her whole life. She never fought back when people treated her badly. I wish she could have seen your story. It would have made her feel less alone." The interview itself was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. The reporter, Maria Gonzalez, was a Latina woman about Eleanor's age, who spoke to Margaret with the warmth of someone who understood the cultural dynamics at play. "Mrs. Santos," Maria began, "you worked for the same family for 37 years. What kept you there so long?" Margaret had prepared for this question, but sitting under the studio lights, she found herself speaking from her heart rather than her prepared notes. "I believed that loyalty would be rewarded," she said simply. "I believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, proved my worth enough, eventually I would be valued as more than just help. I think many women like me believe that. We think if we just serve faithfully enough, we'll earn our place at the table, instead of just serving it." "When did you realize that wasn't going to happen?" Margaret paused, remembering the moment her worldview had shifted forever. "When I got that text message firing me. 37 years reduced to 3 sentences on a phone screen. That's when I understood that to them, I was never a person. I was just a function. When they didn't need the function anymore, they disposed of it." The interview continued for 20 minutes, covering Margaret's story without sensationalizing it. Maria asked thoughtful questions about wage theft in domestic work, about the vulnerability of undocumented workers, about the intersection of class and race in employment relationships. "What would you say to other women in similar situations?" Maria asked near the end. Margaret looked directly into the camera, thinking of all the women like her, the nannies, housekeepers, home health aides, and domestic workers who kept other people's lives running smoothly while their own dreams withered from neglect. "You are not invisible," she said firmly. "You matter. Your work has value, your time has value, and you have rights. Don't let anyone convince you that being grateful for employment means accepting mistreatment. And document everything, not because you're planning to use it against anyone, but because the truth is powerful, and someday you might need that power." After the interview aired that evening, Margaret's phone rang constantly with opportunities she'd never imagined. A publisher wanted her to write a book about her experience. Labor advocacy groups invited her to speak at conferences. A documentary filmmaker wanted to explore her story as part of a larger examination of domestic worker rights. But the call that meant the most came from Luis, her neighbor who had connected her with his lawyer daughter. "Mrs. Santos," he said, his voice warm with pride, "my whole family watched you on TV tonight. My wife," she cried, "she said you spoke for all of us who work hard, but get treated like we don't matter." That weekend, Margaret did something she hadn't done in decades. She went shopping for herself. Not for necessities, not for practical items she needed for work, but for things that brought her joy. She bought a comfortable reading chair for her living room, soft and welcoming in a way that invited relaxation rather than just rest between work shifts. She purchased books, novels she'd seen recommended but never had time to read, biographies of women who'd overcome obstacles, poetry collections that spoke to her soul. She splurged on quality bedding, the kind of Egyptian cotton sheets she'd washed and folded for the Whitmores, but never owned herself. She bought art for her walls. Not expensive pieces, but prints and photographs that made her small apartment feel like a home, rather than just a place to sleep between jobs. Most importantly, she enrolled in a community college ESL teaching certification program. At 63, Margaret Santos was going back to school. "I want to help other women like me," she explained to the admissions counselor. "Women who speak English as a second language, who work in homes and businesses where they're treated as less than human. I want to teach them not just English, but that they have worth beyond their usefulness to others." The first day of classes, Margaret sat in a lecture hall surrounded by people decades younger than herself. The professor, a woman in her 40s, welcomed the students and asked them to introduce themselves and explain their goals. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood up slowly, looking around at the faces watching her with curiosity rather than dismissal. "My name is Margaret Santos," she said clearly. "I'm 63 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was invisible. I'm here to learn how to help other invisible women find their voices." The applause that followed was spontaneous and genuine, the sound of people recognizing courage when they saw it. As Margaret walked across campus after her first class, her new textbooks tucked under her arm, she felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a young woman, the excitement of possibility. For the first time in 37 years, she was building something for herself, investing in her own future rather than maintaining someone else's. The autumn afternoon was warm, and Margaret decided to sit on a bench overlooking the campus quad. Students hurried past, absorbed in their own dreams and ambitions, probably unaware that among them sat a woman who had just discovered that it was never too late to become visible, never too late to matter, never too late to write your own story. Margaret Santos was finally living her own life, and it was beautiful. 1 year later, Margaret stood in front of a classroom filled with 23 women, their faces reflecting the same mixture of hope and exhaustion she remembered from her own mirror just months before. Some were young mothers juggling multiple cleaning jobs to support their families. Others were older women like herself, who'd spent decades invisible in other people's homes. All of them had come to the Los Angeles Community College ESL program, seeking something Margaret understood intimately: the power of being heard. "Today, we're going to practice introducing ourselves," Margaret announced in both English and Spanish, her voice carrying the authority that came from experience rather than education. "Not just your name and where you work, but who you are as a person." A young woman named Carmen, not the nervous housekeeper from the Whitmore estate, but another Carmen, one of dozens Margaret had met who shared that name and similar stories, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Margaret, what if we don't know who we are besides our work?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret felt her heart clench with recognition. She walked over to Carmen's desk and knelt beside her chair, something no one had ever done for Margaret in 37 years of service. "Then we're going to figure it out together," Margaret said gently, "because you are so much more than the floors you clean or the children you watch. You are a daughter, maybe a mother, definitely a woman with dreams that matter." Through the classroom window, Margaret could see the campus quad where she'd sat that first day, marveling at the possibility of her own future. Now she was the one helping others imagine theirs. Her book, The Invisible Woman: Finding Your Voice After a Lifetime of Service, had been published 6 months ago. It wasn't a bestseller, but it had found its audience: domestic workers, caregivers, and service employees who recognized their own stories in Margaret's words. The modest royalties supplemented her savings, but more importantly, the letters from readers reminded her daily that her decision to speak up had mattered. One letter from a woman named Rosa in Miami had moved her to tears. "Mrs. Santos, I have cleaned houses for 15 years. After reading your book, I asked my employers for a raise for the first time ever. They said yes. You gave me the courage to believe I deserved better." Another from a young man in Chicago: "My mother worked as a housekeeper her whole life. She died thinking she didn't matter. I wish she could have read your story. I wish she could have known that women like her are heroes." The documentary about Margaret's story, titled Seen: The Hidden Lives of Domestic Workers, had premiered at the Los Angeles Film Festival and was now streaming on Netflix. Margaret had been nervous about seeing herself on screen, but the filmmaker had treated her story with dignity and used it to highlight the broader issues facing millions of invisible workers across the country. The film had led to speaking engagements at universities, labor conferences and community centers. Margaret found herself traveling to cities she'd only seen on maps, sharing her story with audiences who understood that her experience wasn't unique. It was endemic. At a conference in Seattle, she'd met Dr. Sarah Kim, a sociology professor who was conducting research on domestic worker rights. "Your story illustrates something we've been trying to quantify for years," Dr. Kim had explained. "The emotional labor that domestic workers provide, the care, the loyalty, the family-like devotion, is rarely acknowledged or compensated fairly." Margaret had become an unofficial spokesperson for this invisible workforce, not because she sought the role, but because she understood that visibility could be a form of service too. The Whitmore family had largely disappeared from public life. Richard's legal troubles had resulted in hefty fines and a permanent ban from holding federal office, though he'd avoided prison time. Victoria had divorced him quietly and moved to Europe with a settlement that left her comfortable but no longer wealthy. Sophia had deleted her social media accounts entirely after facing months of online criticism for her treatment of Margaret. Michael had reached out once, sending a letter through Eleanor that simply said, "Mrs. Santos, I'm sorry. You deserved better from all of us. I'm trying to teach my children to treat people with the dignity you always showed us." Margaret had read the letter twice and then filed it away. Some apologies were necessary, but that didn't make them sufficient. The most meaningful change in Margaret's life hadn't been the money or the recognition. It had been the relationships. Her daughters visited more often now, no longer needing to compete with an employer's family for their mother's attention. Her grandchildren knew her as Abuela Margaret, who read them stories and helped with homework, not the tired woman who occasionally appeared between work shifts. Elena had started a small non-profit organization with part of Margaret's settlement money, providing legal aid to domestic workers facing wage theft and discrimination. "You showed me what courage looks like, Mom," she'd said. "Now let me show you what justice looks like." Rosa had used her portion of the settlement to finally pursue her medical degree at 35, enrolling in a pre-med program at UCLA. "It's never too late," she'd told Margaret, echoing the words her mother had finally learned to believe. Margaret's apartment had been transformed from a place to sleep between jobs into a home that reflected her personality. The walls displayed photos from her speaking engagements, certificates from her teaching program, and artwork created by her ESL students. Her kitchen table, a real wooden table, not the card table she'd used for years, was often occupied by students who came for extra help or just to talk. But it was the quiet moments that brought Margaret the most joy. Sunday mornings reading in her comfortable chair with actual coffee, good coffee, not the instant kind she'd sustained herself on for decades. Evening walks through her neighborhood, where shopkeepers now knew her name and story. Phone calls with other women across the country who'd found their own courage to speak up after reading about Margaret's journey. On this particular evening, as Margaret finished grading her students' homework assignments, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something prompted her to answer. "Hello? Is this Margaret Santos?" The voice was young, nervous. "Yes, this is Margaret. My name is Patricia Williams. I used to work for a family in Atlanta. I saw your interview, read your book. I was wondering, could I ask you some questions?" Margaret smiled, settling into her chair. "Of course, Mija. Tell me your story." For the next hour, Margaret listened to Patricia describe a situation hauntingly similar to her own. Years of devoted service, promises of loyalty rewarded with betrayal, and the devastating realization that she'd been valued for her function rather than her humanity. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to fight back," Patricia confessed. "I'm 58 years old. I don't have savings like you did. I don't know any lawyers." "Patricia," Margaret said gently, "being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and speaking your truth anyway. And you don't have to fight alone." Margaret gave Patricia Elena's contact information and connected her with the domestic workers' rights organization that had grown up around Margaret's story. By the time they hung up, Patricia was crying, not from despair, but from relief at finally being heard. These calls came regularly now, women across the country reaching out to the woman who'd shown them that invisible didn't mean powerless. Margaret had become what she'd never had herself, a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for the unseen. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she stopped at her bathroom mirror, the same mirror where she'd practiced her first television interview a year ago. The woman looking back at her was transformed. Not just by better nutrition and less stress, though those showed. Not just by clothes that fit properly and hair that wasn't perpetually pulled back in a utilitarian bun. The transformation was deeper, in her posture, her expression, the way she held her head when she looked at herself. This was a woman who knew her worth. Margaret thought about the girl she'd been at 26, desperate for work and willing to accept any treatment in exchange for a paycheck. She thought about the woman she'd been at 63, broken by decades of invisibility, and convinced she deserved nothing better. And she thought about the woman she was now, 64 years old and finally living her own life, using her voice to lift up others who'd been silenced too long. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her students. "Miss Margaret, I got the promotion. They're making me floor supervisor. Thank you for teaching me I deserve respect." Margaret smiled, saving the message with the dozens of others like it. These were her real rewards, not the settlement money or the media attention, but the knowledge that her courage had sparked courage in others. Tomorrow, she would return to her classroom and continue the work that had become her true calling. Not cleaning up other people's messes, but helping other women clean up their own lives. Not serving someone else's dreams, but nurturing the dreams that had been deferred too long. Before turning off the light, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude. Not for the money or recognition, but for the realization that had changed everything. She had always mattered, even when no one saw her. The only difference now was that she saw herself. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you known someone whose loyalty and hard work went unrecognized, whose dignity was overlooked because of their job or circumstances? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread this message to others who need to know they matter too. Margaret Santos learned that being seen isn't something others give you. It's something you claim for yourself. And once you claim it, you have the power to help others do the same. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.